In the pre-Republic era, the Rakata were the most feared species in the galaxy. They were the builders, the masters of the Infinite Empire, the tyrants of hundreds of enslaved worlds. They were hated and feared by their trillions of subjects, the slave species that the Rakata bled dry in their campaigns of conquest and grandiose vanity projects, and there was no power in the galaxy that could stand up to them. For 10,000 years, the Infinite Empire ruled supreme, and then, in the span of just a few years, it ceased to exist. With the collapse of the Infinite Empire, the Rakata all but vanished from galactic history. They would be forced to flee back to their homeworld, their subjects would erase all their records of their existence, and their Infinite Empire was eventually replaced by the Galactic Republic. But the Rakata didn't just cease to exist after the Infinite Empire's fall. Their people dwindled, but it was a slow process, and their history continued far into the era of the Republic. That's what we'll be talking about today, the forgotten story of the Rakata's post-Imperial history.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Before we get into that though, we need to quickly recap the story of the Infinite Empire itself. The Rakata hailed from the planet Lehon, also known as Rakata Prime, which lay in the unknown regions. Lehon was a tropical ocean world dotted with thousands of islands, which some Rakata claimed to be the remnants of ancient continents and larger landmasses. The planet was full of life, covered by warm, shallow seas and lush jungles, and by many species standards, it might have been a pleasant world were it not for the Rakata. These were a species of tall, amphibious humanoids with smooth skin, sharp claws on their hands and feet, and tall heads with eyes protruding on stalks. They tended to be lean but tough, and between their keen senses, large claws, and resilient hides, they were natural-born hunters. But what made the Rakata truly unique wasn't any of these physical traits. It was their strong, natural connection to the Force. In the old days, virtually every Rakata was Force sensitive, strongly so, and they were also strongly inclined to the dark side. The Rakata were an extremely aggressive and violent people, warlike and sadistic. Though they were social and cooperative enough to be able to form tribes and later large societies, the Rakata were still utterly pitiless, and bloodshed was a fact of life in their societies. They were also cannibalistic, feasting on the flesh of their fallen enemies and even members of their own tribes. This cannibalism was firmly ingrained into Rakatan culture, and the Rakata believed that eating the flesh of a foe would grant them the enemy's power and knowledge. Rakatan hatchlings that were considered weak were eaten raw by their mothers, a form of eugenics that the Rakata believed kept their species strong. All of this cannibalism was deeply interconnected with the Rakata's firm belief in the rule of the strong, that the strong had the right to prove their superiority by murdering and feasting on others. As a consequence of these beliefs, competition was fierce within Rakatan societies, with Rakata often murdering their rivals to increase their own power, and those who were killed in such a way were also cannibalized, sometimes by the whole tribe. It was these two deeply entrenched elements of Rakatan society that caused them to trend toward the dark side, and the dark side's influence only worsened these traits within their society. At first, the Rakata were a somewhat stagnant people. Their constant infighting meant that Rakatan societies larger than tribes tended to fall into civil war pretty quickly. But once the Rakata learned how to use the dark side, their world began to transform rapidly. The dark side instilled the Rakata with the desire to conquer, and it gave the most powerful among them a tool of control, which Rakatan warlords used to unite their planet under a single banner. Once this was accomplished, the Rakata's technology rapidly advanced, as Rakatan scientists learned the ways to combine the power of the dark side with advanced technology. Armed with powerful force-fueled machines, including hyperdrives that could hone in on planets with strong force signatures, the Rakata took to the stars, setting out to conquer and enslave all in their path. The Rakata's force-powered hyperdrives allowed them to spread rapidly across the galaxy, and everywhere they went, they encountered species whose technology was much less advanced than theirs. They conquered these species without mercy, enslaving them en masse or simply exterminating them outright. The Rakata harvested Force sensitives from among these new subjects to use as living batteries in their Great War machines, while the rest were conscripted as manual laborers, made to work to death, stripping their own homeworlds of usable resources. By 35,000 BBY, the Builders had conquered all of their neighbors in the unknown regions, and the Rakata ruling castes declared themselves the rulers of an infinite empire, one that would conquer first the galaxy and then all the universe. By 30,000 BBY, the infinite empire had triumphed over all of its rivals, becoming the ultimate power in the galaxy. The Rakata ruled over 500 worlds spread far across the galaxy, enslaving trillions in the process, and they proved frighteningly efficient in how they harvested every available resource on these planets, from sentient beings to natural resources. They not only used these resources to fuel their conquests, but also to build great monuments to the infinite empire on their conquered worlds, as well as enormous machines of terrible power beyond the understanding of later generations of scientists. No power in the galaxy could stand against the infinite empire at its height, and for thousands of years, the Rakata were the uncontested masters of the galaxy. The infinite empire transformed the worlds it conquered, and it transformed Rakatan society as well. The old tribes were replaced with a rigid hierarchical caste system, which allowed the Rakata to continue their merciless competition and jockeying for power while maintaining the hegemony of the infinite empire. Primarily, the infinite empire was divided into two castes: the priest caste, which ruled the infinite empire and operated its force-based technology, and the warrior caste, who slew the empire's enemies and used the force to fuel their battle fury. The Rakata distinguished their castes based on skin color. Priest caste Rakata had a reddish tinge to their tan hides, while warrior caste Rakata had a black tinge. Competition within both of these castes was fierce, particularly within the priest caste, in which Rakata jockeyed for the highest positions of power in the infinite empire. The Rakata's dominance over the galaxy was fueled by a machine of unstoppable conquest, an enormous space station known as the Starforge. The Starforge was built in low orbit above Lehon's sun, from which it siphoned enormous volumes of stellar matter and solar radiation. By drawing on the dark side to power itself, it used these to produce near infinite numbers of war material, from weapons and war droids to starfighters and capital ships. The Starforge gave the Rakata an infinite armada, which they sought to use to conquer all the universe. But the Starforge wasn't just an incredibly advanced machine. The dark side was so concentrated within it that the Starforge developed a will of its own and a deep, insatiable hunger. It fed on death, and it consumed its users, drawing their negative emotions to fuel itself. It took a being of immense power to use the Starforge. Anyone else who tried would be utterly consumed by the machine. Even those strong enough to control the Starforge would be influenced by it, and indeed, the entire Rakatan people soon fell under its control. Over the course of millennia under the Starforge's shadow, the Rakata began to change. The Starforge fed on their anger and hate, their desire to conquer and hunger for power, and it accentuated these traits within its masters so that it could feed more. As the influence of the Starforge grew, the Rakata became more violent and power-hungry, enough to threaten the social cohesion of their empire. As a result, the Infinite Empire entered a period of decline, and before long, the Rakata began to turn on each other. Circa 25,500 BBY, after millennia of steady decline, the Infinite Empire was riven by a full-scale war that erupted between the Rakata. This brutal conflict greatly weakened the Empire, and even as it spread across the Rakata's conquered territories, the Rakata were also struck by a plague. This disease only affected the Rakata, and it spread to every corner of the Infinite Empire. Billions of Rakata died of the disease, and those who survived it suffered what many of them considered an even worse fate. They were stripped of their connection to the Force. This mutation of the plague left the Rakata unable to operate their own technology, and the Infinite Empire was crippled. In 25,200 BBY, with the Rakata weakened, their slave species all rose up at once, driving the Infinite Empire from their homes and slaughtering any Rakata they could find. Those Rakata who survived were forced to flee back to Lehon. Even as the Infinite Empire unraveled, however, the Rakata's civil war continued. Many of those Rakata who fled back to Lehon became caught up in it, and some of them fled a second time, retreating to colonies elsewhere in the unknown regions. The Infinite Empire was reduced to a shadow of its former self, enduring only on Lehon and the colonies of the Rakatan Archipelago, where the Rakatan remnants hid from the vengeance of their former slaves. The survivors in the archipelago more or less abandoned their people's civil war and gathered into new tribes, some of which abandoned the use of their advanced technology, and some of which did not. But on Lehon, the civil war continued to escalate. The warrior caste and priest caste turned against one another, and each of them came under the control of vicious warlords. One day, these warlords unleashed weapons of mass destruction against one another, sparking a planet-wide nuclear war that devastated Lehon. On that day, the age of the Infinite Empire came to an end, and for the most part, so did the history of the Rakata. Lehon was forever transformed, with most of its great cities obliterated or lost beneath the rising oceans, and the Rakata were all but wiped out. Only a few managed to escape the devastation, mostly by fleeing deep underground, where they became a tribal, low-tech people once more, left in a post-apocalyptic world. Over the course of the next few millennia, Lehon's environment slowly recovered. The cities of the Infinite Empire were destroyed, and much of the planet's former landmasses were submerged by rising oceans, but on the islands that remained above water, the jungles soon rebounded, quickly reclaiming the ruins of Rakatan civilization. Some of Lehon's original animal life survived on the islands as well, while many creatures that the Rakata had taken from other worlds went wild and integrated themselves into local ecosystems, such as rancors. Eventually, the surviving Rakata began to emerge as well. The first Rakata to come out of hiding were the last remnants of the Infinite Empire's priest caste. On the day the warlords unleashed their weapons of mass destruction, their ancestors had taken shelter within the Temple of the Ancients, one of the most important installations on Lehon. This temple was where the Infinite Empire's priest caste had stored records of the Infinite Empire's history, demographic data, and the secrets of its most powerful technology, and it was extremely well protected. The temple had a disruptor field generator that caused critical mechanical failures on unauthorized starships on approach to the Star Forge, which was the space station's first line of defense, and the temple itself was protected by extremely powerful shields. These shields allowed the Rakatan priests taking shelter within the Temple of the Ancients to survive the nuclear apocalypse that killed all others who remained on the surface, and it kept their descendants safe inside until they could return to the surface world. When the priests' descendants emerged from the Temple of the Ancients, they were horrified by the devastation they saw around them, and at last, they saw the error of their people's ways. These Rakata renounced the legacy of the Infinite Empire and the terrible crimes of their ancestors, and they also came to understand the terrible power of their ancestors' technology. They scoured what remained of Lehon, gathering up all that remained of the Infinite Empire's terrible weapons, which they sealed away inside the Temple of the Ancients to ensure they would never be used again. These Rakata then established a small village not far from the ancient monument, from which they kept watch over the temple and prevented anyone from getting inside. These Rakata eventually took to calling themselves the Elders, and the other Rakata tribes later took to calling them the Red Rakata, as they shared the complexion of their priest caste ancestors. For thousands upon thousands of years, the Elders stood vigil in the south beach of their lonely island. They relied primarily on much simpler technology than their ancestors had, but this was a deliberate choice on their part. The Elders retained full knowledge of Rakatan history and understood most of their ancestors' advanced technology, but they also understood that their ancestors' technology, particularly the corrupting and manipulative Starforge, was part of what had brought about the Rakata's near extinction, so they chose to live simpler lives. With the exception of a few droids, a computer archive, some handheld weapons, and perimeter defenses for their compound, the Elders sealed all their advanced tech within the temple. This eventually meant that, even if the Elders wanted to reclaim their ancestors' technology, they were unable to. While the Elders knew the ritual chants that could lower the temple's shields, there was another force field protecting the temple that only allowed force sensitives to enter. At first, a few among the Elders whose ancestors had escaped the plague remained force sensitive, but inbreeding among the Elders' small population eventually meant that no force sensitives remained among them. For millennia, The Elders were the only Rakata on Lehon's surface, but their solitude didn't last forever. Many other Rakata, almost all of them the warrior caste, had hidden deep underground on the day of the nuclear war, and thousands of years after the collapse of the Infinite Empire, they began to emerge from their caves. These Black Rakata, as they came to call themselves, were every bit as violent and bloodthirsty as their ancestors, and they formed warring tribes that soon spread across the islands of Lehon. Unlike the Elders, these Rakata knew nothing of their ancestors' technology, and they lived as simple hunter-gatherers for the most part. Over time, however, some Rakatan tribes did gain a few forms of more advanced tech, primarily through scavenging. The Elders had long ago recovered most of the Infinite Empire era tech left over on Lehon's surface, but new technology found its way to the planet over the course of millennia. Throughout the Age of the Republic, many scouts sought hyperspace routes from the core worlds west into the unknown regions as part of Republic exploration initiatives. Most of them didn't get anywhere, but some stumbled upon a route that led from Coruscant all the way out to Lehon. Those who followed this route ended up in the disruptor field protecting the Starforge, however, and crashed on Lehon's surface. These crashes littered the planet with space wrecks, which the Rakata tribes stripped of anything they found interesting, killing and eating any survivors they came across in the process. The Rakata hoarded the off-worlder technology they stripped from the wrecks, and while most of it was beyond their ability to understand, they did manage to figure out how to use some of what they found, most notably vibro swords. These tribes' memory of Rakatan history had been distorted, becoming myths and legends, but those myths can tell us a lot about how these Rakata understood their world and their place in it. In Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, the player can talk at length with the Loremaster of one tribe, Loremaster Giorgi, to learn about the tribe's understanding of their history and mythology, and to give you a better idea of what these Rakata were like, we're now going to quote him at length, beginning with his recounting of the Rakata's origins. In the times before our most ancient histories, there was nothing you could call the Rakatan people. There were unintelligent proto-Rakata wandering the surface of this world. Spawned from the womb of this world, they were gifted with the brilliance of thought, but not tempered with the wisdom to use it. When the gods of the sky first spoke to them, the ground shook and heaved, and fires raced across the surface of the world. They fled beneath the ground to escape the calamity and dwelt there for some time. At last, the gods spoke to them in dreams of the surface and the light. They re-emerged from the ground and found the land much changed around them. Gone were the plains and valleys they'd known. Instead, there were islands stretching across the breadth of the world. The world had been remade for them by the gods of the sky, and they gave thanks in fear and gratitude. The world is ruled by the gods of the earth and sky, both living and dead. When the sky gods remade the world, the gods of the earth, who had sheltered and protected the Rakata, were gone. Whether dead or asleep, they have not been heard from again. Nor do the gods in the sky listen to our pleas any longer, although we can still see their lights gleam in the heavens. So, we mortal Rakata are left here to our own devices to make the future we demand for ourselves. Our skin had been hardened and turned black from the time our people spent beneath the surface, but always at the fringes of society there were rumors. Rumors of those of other colors who survived above the surface while we dwelt below. These tribes remembered the time of the Infinite Empire, but only distantly and only as a planetary rather than an interstellar empire. They also seem to have gotten the order of events mixed up. While Giorgi's description of the cataclysm that remade the surface world seems to be a distortion of the Infinite Empire's collapse, he claims that the Infinite Empire rose and fell after the cataclysm, which is, of course, incorrect. But the tribes remembered the Infinite Empire regardless, and they did so fondly. To again quote Giorgi, "Back in the days of the First Awakening, when our people rose from the ground and brought the light of civilization to our new world, our people spread far and wide across all the islands. Among these peoples, there were some that rose to greatness on the largest islands. Rakatans of vision and forethought who built great monuments to themselves and their leaders. But these cultures didn't know their true strengths. They didn't draw upon the knowledge of their past to feed their present. Of course, these cultures, with their centers of learning and their great temples, collapsed in riots and chaos, burning their cultures from the world in an orgy of violence. It was 1,000 years of darkness before the light of the First Empire rose upon the blood of the past. With the first civilizations of our people destroyed and chaos and anarchy sweeping the islands, it seemed that a time of darkness had descended upon us that would never end. But a strong nation of survivors yet endured. On one of the smaller islands near the equatorial regions, they had not forgotten the oldest traditions, those learned from the gods of the earth while we dwelt beneath the surface. Taking the knowledge of their elders and passing their wisdom and skills onto the next generation by eating their flesh, they built a culture unrivaled throughout history. Greater even than your vaunted republic. For millennia, this empire stood, uniting the many islands of our world into one cohesive whole, each generation passing its strength on to the one that followed. But fate was unkind to these great Rakata, these first ones of our kind to rise above savagery and create a true, lasting civilization. We can pinpoint no direct cause for the collapse of the First Empire, but it was swift and total. What had taken centuries to build and was maintained for thousands of years disappeared within 10, perhaps 20 years. For the ancient cities we've examined, there was much fighting and death, as well as fires that burned bright and hot enough to melt the stones of their palaces to glass. Also, in scattered fragments and records, we've heard of people being found, a people unlike the Rakata, but taking our form, who waged a monumental war that tore civilization apart. What this war was, or who those beings were, we don't know, but they're the demons of our legends now. We believe them to be gone, wiped out in that vast conflagration, but we cannot know for sure. Our civilization lapsed back into savagery. We were no longer the great people of centuries past. Brother turned on brother, tribesman on tribesman, until all fought and sought to destroy each other. The legacy of the final war and the collapse that came after it still echo with us today. We are still a fractured people. Many tribes dwell on these islands, warring with each other constantly. Each seeks to grow its own strength, absorbing that of its enemies through their flesh, cut down in battle, but none has been strong enough to exert their influence over more than a handful of islands. Until now, that is. While the more technologically advanced elders looked back on their imperial past with shame, the tribal Rakata were nostalgic for the age of the Infinite Empire, and they even retained elements of their ancestors' colonialist worldview, seeing the current condition of their people as savagery. They longed to re-establish the half-remembered glory days of the Infinite Empire, and in Lawmaster Jashi's time, it seemed that this dream might soon be fulfilled. Around 4000 BBY, at about the time the Republic was embroiled in the Great Sith War, a Rakata who would set out to change the face of his world hatched. He grew up as an orphan, living in poverty with no one to rely on but himself, but it was later said that his life of hardship gave him a curious strength. When he was a child, he killed and feasted upon a Mandalorian warrior that had crash-landed on Lehon, and by the time he reached adulthood, he was renowned as his tribe's greatest warrior. This young warrior's true name is unknown, but his followers referred to him simply as the One. Not long after coming of age, the One challenged the chieftain of his tribe to single combat, and the chieftain, knowing full well that the young upstart would defeat him, offered himself up without a fight, allowing the tribe to feast on his flesh and granting the chieftainship to the One. With rule over his tribe secured, the One then set out on a campaign of conquest, conquering all of the other tribes on the island and devouring their chieftains. But conquering the whole island wasn't enough for him. He sought to conquer all of Lehon to establish a second empire that would restore the Rakata to glory. Over the course of 20 years, the One and his ever-growing army conquered over 100 islands, subjugating every tribe in their path. His followers came to see him as a demigod sent to deliver the Rakata from barbarism, and even his enemies feared and respected him. The One believed that nothing could stand in his way forever, but before long, he came upon an enemy that would test that belief. In his conquests, the One heard rumor of the Temple of the Ancients, and so he and 1,000 of his finest warriors traveled to the island where it lay, hoping to claim it for his cause. Believing that the secrets and technology sealed within the temple would be the key to establishing the Second Empire, the One established a base camp on the island's north beach and then marched south to secure the temple. But upon arriving at the Temple of the Ancients, the One and his warriors found they couldn't enter due to the temple's shields and due to their lack of force sensitivity. They soon came upon a group of elder scouts roaming the islands, who they captured and interrogated, torturing them in the hopes of learning the secret of how to enter the temple. Through this, the One learned that the elders were the guardians of the temple of the ancients and knew the way in, and so he set out to conquer the elders and take their secrets for his own. But the One's warriors were thwarted by the elders' technology, which killed hundreds of the One's troops and prevented them from breaching the walls of the elders' compound. Taking the temple would not be as easy as the One had thought, but he was nonetheless unwilling to leave the island behind until the temple of the ancients was his. He converted his warriors' base camp into a more permanent settlement, where he and his followers remained entrenched for years, fighting many skirmishes with the elders and trying and failing to enter the temple. As the One remained committed to this stalemate, his empire began to weaken, rebellions sprang up on the other side of his territory, and the One's influence began to wane. But still, the One remained committed to taking the temple, and one day, an apparent answer to all of his problems fell from the sky. In 3959 BBY, a new starship crashed on Lehon, not far from the Temple of the Ancients. The One's warriors set out to loot the crash site, only to be utterly massacred by two warriors wielding strange weapons and terrible magic. The surviving Rakata bowed before the two interlopers, and on their request, they brought the new arrivals to the One. The interlopers used their powers to rip the Rakatan language from the One's mind and give him and his followers the ability to understand Basic, and then they introduced themselves as Revan and Malak, beings of great power who had come in search of the Starforge. The One told the two that the key to what they sought was locked within the Temple of the Ancients, and he offered to help them enter the temple if they wiped out the elders and brought back their secrets. Revan accepted his offer, and he and Malak set out to the elders' compound. But the two soon-to-be Sith had no intentions of fulfilling their oath. Instead, they just went to the elders and asked them for help in gaining access to the temple instead. Revan told the Elder Council that he sought to destroy the Starforge, and the elders, who had long wished that they could remove that blight from their skies, were all too happy to help him. The elders gave Revan and Malak access to the temple, which the two used to shut off the disruptor field that was keeping them away from the Starforge. But instead of destroying the Starforge, as they promised, Revan and Malak took control of it, using it to unleash a vast Sith armada upon an unsuspecting galaxy. Revan's order of Sith and Dark Jedi set up camp in the Temple of the Ancients, and after figuring out how to make the ships of the Sith fleet immune to the disruptor field, Revan had the field reactivated. The elders fumed at this betrayal, but they could do nothing about it. But then, 3 years later, another ship fell from the sky. This was the Ebon Hawk, and its crew was led by the man the Rakata had encountered before, none other than Revan himself. The Jedi Council had erased Revan's memories, turned him back to the light side, and sent him on a quest to destroy the Starforge, but after locating the Starforge and arriving in the Lehon system, the Ebon Hawk had been caught in the disruptor field and crashed. Revan soon began retracing his steps from his last visit. After encountering emissaries of the One, he once again agreed to help the One defeat the Elders, and he then met with the Elders, who he tried to convince help him to enter the Temple of the Ancients. This time, however, the Elders refused to help Revan without a show of good faith. When Revan told him of how his mind had been destroyed, the Elder Council believed him, but they were still loath to risk trusting him again. To prove that he had truly changed, they demanded he risk his life for someone else by retrieving one of their captured scouts from the One's camp. Revan agreed, and after slaying the One and virtually his entire army, he and his followers managed to rescue the Elder's scout, earning access to the Temple of the Ancients. Once more, Revan shut off the disruptor field, and this time, he actually did destroy the Starforge, slaying Malak and helping Republic forces win a decisive victory in the Battle of Rakata Prime. Revan and the rest of the Ebon Hawk crew were honored by the Republic Admiralty in a ceremony just outside the Temple of the Ancients later that day. Not long afterwards, the Elders made formal contact with the Republic, making their first steps toward re-entering galactic society. Between the Elders' contact with the Republic and the death of the One, the end of the Jedi Civil War was the beginning of a new age for Lehon. The One's empire shattered, and the Rakatan tribes returned to their endless civil war, which became bloodier than ever as warlords attempted to fill the power vacuum the One had left behind. The Elders, meanwhile, joined the Republic as observers, and links between Lehon and the Republic were established. These links were mostly symbolic, however, a show of reconciliation between the elders and the descendants of the victims of their ancient ancestors. Though a few elder Rakata chose to leave Lehon and travel the galaxy, most remained behind, continuing to live as they had for the past 20,000 years. The Republic, for its part, sought to protect Lehon and its people from treasure hunters and opportunists, and to do so, they designated the entire Lehon system a historical preserve, which the Republic tightly controlled access to. Only those with Republic authorization were allowed to enter the system, and the very existence of Lehon was kept obscure. To prevent treasure hunting or a panic over a possible Rakatan resurgence, the Republic kept Lehon's history vague in official records, and only the most knowledgeable of academics had any idea of the planet's true historical significance. Even many of those who had heard of the Infinite Empire and the Rakata's history didn't believe it, considering it far-fetched that such an apparently primitive species could have ruled the whole galaxy in the distant past. Consequently, tourism and other visits to Lehon were minimal from the beginning, and they decreased over time, as wreckage from the Battle of Rakata Prime littered the system with debris, which were a navigational hazard. Despite the Republic's efforts to protect Lehon and what remained of the Rakata, however, the Rakatan population began to steadily diminish. The elders, who had already become more than a little inbred over the millennia, became too few to maintain sufficient genetic diversity in their gene pool, despite their scientists' efforts to introduce new genes into the mix. The tribes, meanwhile, spent the centuries slaughtering each other to such a degree that casualty rates outpaced birth rates, and so the Rakata as a species steadily dwindled. Contact between Lehon and the Republic ceased during the New Sith Wars, leading to a scientific expedition to the planet during the Republic Dark Age between 1100 and 1000 BBY. By the time this expedition arrived, the Rakata on Lehon were all gone, and as far as the galaxy knew, the Rakata as a species was extinct. Unbeknownst to the Republic, the Rakata on Lehon weren't the last of their kind. A little further into the unknown regions from Lehon was a small sector of space known as the Rakatan Archipelago, that collection of Rakatan colonies that we mentioned earlier. There, Rakata actually survived all the way to the modern era, albeit in isolation from virtually all other galactic civilizations. The Rakata of these colonies developed in different ways. Some of these colonies, such as the Grillstrik, Malata, and Persapa, were dominated by mutated creatures the Rakata had brought from other worlds, which a few scattered and primitive Rakata tribes lived in fear of. On the planets Hilak and Fitomp, the Rakata had followed a path similar to the tribal Rakata of Lehon, dividing into scattered tribes that waged endless wars with one another, as well as with the indigenous sentience of their adopted homeworlds. These tribes believed their adopted homeworlds were all there was in the universe, and they completely forgot both the technology and history of their ancestors. But the Rakata of two colonies, Tulpa and Makatak, had retained both their ancestors' technology and knowledge of their history, and unlike the elders of Lehon, they sought to rebuild the ancient Infinite Empire. These two nations of Rakata regained space travel and hyperspace capability by reclaiming old Rakatan skip ships, and they began competing against one another for resources, slaves, and territory. By the modern era of galactic history, the Rakata of Tulpa and Makatak had even set out to build their own, scaled-down versions of the Starforge, which they hoped to use to begin a new era of Rakatan dominance in the galaxy. Fortunately for the galaxy, these Rakatan exiles ultimately didn't get very far, and their territories were fairly small and located in a remote patch of the unknown regions. Apart from the handful of species they had enslaved, very few even knew of their existence, and even among the peoples of the unknown regions, the Rakatan remnants were hardly a power player. The Tulpa and Makatak Rakata themselves lived in fear of the Vagari Empire, which they avoided at all costs, a far cry from the Rakata of old, who no one was strong enough to challenge openly. So that's our look at the slow decline of the Rakata species following the collapse of the Infinite Empire. But what do you think? Do you want to see more Rakata content in the future? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.